I'm Nader Kaizat, your host today, the iOS Discipline Lead. And as we join in for another topic for Lightning Talk, my Android counterpart, Greg, will be talking about accessibility. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today as we wish him a safe flight, but he recorded his Lightning Talk. And then feel free to write any comments if you have any questions, and then we will try to answer them here after his video is completed. So with that said, let me start the video.
And today I'm going to be giving an introduction talk about accessibility and also accessibility on Android. From a high level, we're going to start off just talking about what is accessibility, some general ideas surrounding it, and we're going to get a little bit into design ethics and ethos about why we want to consider accessibility. And towards the end, we'll talk a little bit more about the accessibility tools on Android and how to really consider and use some of them. So with that being said, let me share my screen and we can kick it off. Let's do that. All right. Well, what is accessibility? Usually it's shortened to A11Y because there's 11 letters between the A and the Y, and by shortening it, you're making it more accessible to type. So if you ever see A11Y, that means accessibility. But what it really means is that everyone, regardless of their ability or uniqueness, can use your product or service the same way. Every person should have access. No element, your product, your design, or your experience is exclusive to people with only certain capabilities. We should do this because we should be inclusive. We should be allowing anyone to use our products, and we should not be trying to say, oh, well, you're not allowed to. Even though we probably never intend to exclude people, certain design decisions can be necessarily exclusive, even if we never intended it. A great example is, my favorite accessibility example in the world you see every day is ramps. There are stairs everywhere, but if there's an entrance to a building that doesn't have a ramp on it, people who are in wheelchairs or maybe just not as brisk of walkers will have challenge getting into your building. Do you want your building to be inaccessible to people? I'm sure that you don't want that. So ramps are one of the biggest and most common examples of accessibility. And the more I think you look around the world, the more you will find moments where you ask, is this for everybody, or is somebody actually being left out because of an unconscious decision being made? And that's the reality too, is a lot of unconscious decisions. But speaking of apps, kind of why do we care? Well, first of all, good accessibility will increase your app's reach. World Bank says that 15% of the people in the world have some form of disability. When it comes to applications, that could be poor sight. That could be color blindness, like deuteranopia or triteranopia. It could be myopia, like cataracts or other problems focusing. So all these things could be considered disabilities that apps will need to help with. And to say that our phones are not a vital part of our lives every single day is silly. And so everyone, no matter if they do or do not have myopia or deuteranopia, will have to use a phone. So if you make your app accessible, you can basically make sure that everyone can use your product. And another thing about that is versatility. This example here comes from Google about if you have voiceover capability, somebody can cook while using your app. But I also like to think that the versatility goes even further, that it means you could share this app and the experience with the people around you. It also means that from a larger perspective, which we might care about, is government institution requirements. The expectations for accessibility are no longer just from QA being nitpicky, but they can sometimes legitimately be required for business. Governments really need accessibility because the government cannot be, discriminatory. But even certain fields like medical foundationally have to be accessible because otherwise, there is ideas of discrimination, or it would mean that certain people are unable to access a good or service that is medically allowed to them. If there is a medical application that is somehow being subsidized by Medicare, Medicaid, or insurance companies, you can bet that it will have to be accessible. Otherwise, your service is now unavailable to certain people. So accessibility does matter in the large scope of business these days. So in general, here are three of my broad ideas on what makes good accessibility. These are not official. These are just Greg's personal specials. I think flexible UI is the first one. The second one is purposeful color usage. And the third is assistive tool implementations. So what do I mean by this? Flexible UI. Honestly, at the start, there are many phones. There are many sizes of phones. There are many densities of phones. Just because a phone is physically big, it might not have a lot of pixels. It might be a really big 720 or a really tiny 1440. So just going by pixels or screen size is not enough. Additionally to that, one of the most major first level accessibility things that you see is font magnification, display scaling. Now we can talk a bit more about localization in a second and multiple screen dimensions, but those two you see everywhere. Particularly, here's an example from Android about changing the font size on your phone. You can do this on iOS, use on Android, but you can legitimately just say, I want every font in the entire operating system, in every app, on every screen blown up. I want it bigger. A lot of people do this, particularly the more senior generation. My parents do it. And the unfortunate reality is this tends to make a lot of designs and layouts look bad. You know, a lot of designs sometimes are made with the idea of two things side by side, or that all this information will fit very cleanly on this graph. But if there's font magnification on, or just the size of the screen being used is not common, you cannot ensure that things are going to have to be that way. You can't legitimately say, I want it only to be 60 pixels, because that's not a legit measurement when you're thinking about scalability. For example, let's say we have a very normal row like this with label on the left, value on the right. Well, what happens when we have a ton of words over here? Does it push this side over? Maybe. What about when we have a ton of words on the right side and only one word on the left side? Oh man, left side got pushed off. What about when it's a very thin screen? You know, how much dead space, how much dead white space are we going to get here? Now, this is somewhat of a consideration for design, much more than accessibility, but this one here is a concern for accessibility because we have now lost vital information on the page. So this starts getting the idea of localization. Will your application literally have the word label 17 times? No. But is it possible that you will one day have to have your application work in Dutch? Maybe. There's some really big words like in Dutch and German, just huge words without spaces. And if you're ever considering that my UI is going to only ever have this word in it, you're going to foundationally cripple your own ability, your UI's for ability for flexibility. Yeah, that's a fun word. Looking even further, you know, if we think about, well, what if we truncate, you know, ellipsize instead of letting a wrap, you know, what if we ellipsize? And, you know, that's a value as well. It's a possibility. But then we are, again, losing context. If somebody is relying on reading the screen, we have foundationally removed information that they might require. So accessibility goes even down into how is the screen presenting information? Are certain things being pushed off, certain things being pushed on? Are we truncating? Are we wrapping? Are we making sure everything that's vitally important is still there? So this is just a highlight of flexible UI and why you don't want to remove information. If this is a banking app or a medical app, and somehow you couldn't see what is the name of my medication or when is it expired because it rolled off the page and I had to turn the font size up, I'm screwed. I can't actually see the information I need. You know, that's a problem. So as a developer, when I get a design and I want to think of accessibility, I have a couple of things I first do. First of all, I try to avoid side-by-side layouts, as you saw in those examples. I would try to discuss the worst case scenario with my designers, throw in a bunch of words onto both sides. How do they push each other? How do they grow each other? Because if the information is vitally important, we can't lose any of it. Additionally, value areas need to grow as they can, as we saw there where areas grew and wrapped. The information is important, you need to make sure it's there. A lot of people know what lorem ipsum is, but I really recommend throwing the lorem ipsum paragraph into all your previews and all of your work at the start when you're designing your layouts. That way you can really see it look awful. Additionally, everything kind of needs to be scrollable. Whenever you're going to design where it's like, I want something pinned to the bottom, something pinned to the top, you don't know how much screen space you're really going to have because every phone is different. The aspect ratios are different, the heights are different. So I always try to make everything at least scrollable. That way, if things do need X amount of space, they're not gone, they're just down. Versus if we had really rigid amounts of space, certain things would get clipped, overdrawn, or just not be visible. So that's kind of a per design thing, but I always try to make sure that scrollability is concerned. To that same point too, hard-coded sizes. Unless it's an icon, don't do it. If it's an image or something like that, you can use aspect ratio, or you can use weights to give percentiles of overall. Those are much more flexible than anything with a legitimate 32.dp. Try to avoid sizes if you can. And as I said, the only real use of size should be like iconography. That's kind of the gist of how, in my head, my first run through of good accessible design is. Let's get a little more theoretical. Colors. Now, a lot of this discussion might also come back to our designers, what they provide us in Figma, or the design language being used, or the material palette being used. But there are certain things that we can consider and make sure of to help our design partners and the people in product make the right decisions. Particularly, there's a thing called WCAG, WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I know it says web, but trust me, everyone uses it. iOS, Android, everybody uses WCAG. It's become an industry standard for anything technology-based. Now, they have different levels of certification, A, AA, AAA. AA is about where people try to go. AAA is amazing, but very, very few people ever get to AAA. So a lot of companies shoot for AA. The importance of that is for light mode and dark mode, you got to make sure that your colors, your fonts, your images, everything can be seen, because light mode and dark mode have become huge across the industry these days. But just choosing a singular color might look good in white, but in dark mode, that color might not actually stand out that much on a black background. Additionally, you have to consider high contrast and bold accessibility modes, because those have different accessibility ratios as required. The interesting thing here is what color, the color contrast accessibility is based off of contrast alone, not hex, but contrast, relativity towards the other things around it, generally the background. So here I have a link from the WCAG 2.1 spec, and you'll see that it says texts or images of text need to have a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 to their background. What does that mean? Get to that in a second. But you can also see here that there's also subcategories. Large text or bold text, title text, these have incidental. Is you should try to really avoid text on top of images. That is a scenario where you really can't control necessarily what the background image might be, or that it will have the appropriate contrast ratio for something that is a very interesting looking background. If you ever notice it, that's why something like Netflix, they have a carousel of movie images, right? Posters of movies, but they don't have actual text labels, because they know that their labels would never be appropriately contrasted to the image. So actually all of Netflix, all of those types of sites are image only. There's never a text label on them when you're scrolling through movies because of this reason. It would not be accessible. So when we were talking about contrast ratio though, how do you check that? There are a lot of tools online to help you. Hopefully you can work with your designers to make sure that hex colors work against each other versus the background they're on and the color they are. But here's just a great example. The red on white is a 4 to 1. Very good, solid stuff. That green, it's kind of hard to see. It's 1.4 to 1. That blue is very, very visible, 8.6 to 1. Now, that's not always true though, because that's white. Look over here, the same blue is not distinct enough on a gray background here. Now with a slightly darker gray background and bolding, it does satisfy the 3 to 1 contrast ratio. And also if you are using it as like a border, there is enough ratio contrast there, because the duality of the background and foreground colors do create enough chromatic difference to make it there. This is a very hard thing to know off the top of your head. Hopefully you can make sure your color palettes and your color usage does apply to these ratios, but it's important to make sure that no matter what mode you're in or the colors you're deciding to use, that they do have the appropriate contrast ratios so that accessibility is helped out. Because if you don't, certain things just literally become invisible to certain people. They cannot determine the difference. And if you use color as an indication of any information or any highlight or what they need to know about, that could be a real trouble if they can't actually tell the difference between what's focused and what's not. In that scenario too, this is a little more color theory, but certain colors also mean certain things, like red, use it for an error or stop or high attention. Similarly, blue, every tech company's logo is blue. Facebook, Twitter, sorry, X used to be. All those companies are just like that soft sky blue. It's inviting, it's energetic, it has neutrality. Multicolor logos and colors means everything. Windows logos, 4 colors. Google and Chrome logos, 4 colors. Because they're not trying to say that we are one thing, we are all things. So sometimes when using color, make sure you're using the right color for the moment. You know, a red button might, some people will not ever press a red button just because it's red. Or if somebody responds poorly, you know, if somebody wants to say, how are you feeling today? And if the sad face is red, they might not want to ever select sad, but they want to be red. You know, and also that it stigmatizes like, oh, well, is happy face green and sad face red? I don't want to be red. I don't feel red. I feel sad, but not red, not angry. So therefore, color can be very important in your choices. So putting that together, try to avoid putting text top of an image, especially with a robust CRM like Netflix. This is why they don't do it. Gradients. If you have a really cool background pattern or gradient, remember that's a scale. You have to check from your very lowest gradient or color hex on the gradient to your very darkest and your lightest and compare what text you're going to put on it to make sure that the contrast ratio still works and verifies against all of it. And also, going back to the idea of subtle colors, if you want to use something subtle that potentially doesn't have enough contrast ratio, it can't be vitally important to the user experience. Something subtle is like shadows, borders, drop Z buffers. Those things that look great. They look fantastic in designs. And it's the entire card material theme identity is based around the card. But if it's important the user is able to tell what thing is currently highlighted, or that these subtleties imply some functionality, some active, focused, proper positive action or negative call to action, these things have to be a high enough contrast and also thick enough that they're visible. Subtlety can be your enemy in getting good user experience. And also it could be quite a negative in accessibility because if somebody cannot tell, that's what they were supposed to touch. You know, especially with something like deuteranopia, you know, red-green color blindness. That one really hurts the people if buttons are green for good and red for bad. Like, ooh, they sometimes don't even know what they're looking at. So finally, I want to come to the really engineering focused one. All of our phones these days do have assistive technologies built into them, whether that's VoiceOver on iOS or TalkBack on Android. So Android has the accessibility suite made by Google. It is not inherently a part of the Android operating system, but it is pretty much in every single phone because of the Google Play services. The only place you will not find the Android accessibility suite is like on Amazon Kindle tablets. It's a different thing. That's Amazon versus Google. But as you can see here, you can have TalkBack tutorial within it. You can have highlighting of the text. You can have navigation through it. And this is pretty much the way that accessibility is done. And pretty much everyone has this tool, but if you don't have it, like on an emulator or a rooted custom ROM, like Cyanogen, you can download the APK and sideload it. And now I say that because I did not sideload mine. It's kind of a pain. And so I did some recording of my physical phone just to show you guys how it really looks and works. The first thing I wanted to show you guys was what I do is you can set a shortcut on your phone to turn accessibility on and off, which is holding the volume up and down buttons for 3 seconds. So I wanted to show you guys here. One important thing to remember is Android is everything. There's no one Android operating system. Every OEM can create their own fork of Android and customize it all the way to hell and back. So it is very difficult to tell somebody exactly how to go into settings and find the option. It's pretty much different for from Samsung to LG to OnePlus. So I would always search for it. Just always search accessibility and you'll find it. But they all should have this. So this is me finding the accessibility shortcut on my phone and turning it on. And I recommend pretty much every developer and QA in the world do this with your phones because you're going to need it. So you look here. I'm just going to search for it. accessibility because it's different on every phone. Now that I found it, it was that first one. Now advanced, I go to the bottom and there's a shortcut. You can see it says shortcut from lock screen. I hold the volume buttons, I can turn accessibility on and off immediately instead of having to drill through this menu. This is going to help everybody's life if you do this on your phone. So I'm going to turn that on and we're good to go. Now that you all know how to turn on accessibility, assuming that you have a Google phone, I'm going to now show you a video of me actually using TalkBack in an application. Now, this demo application I'm going to show you is actually going to be something we dive into more in about 3 weeks' time at our Android Summit, but it seems like a good opportunity to get you guys a little excited for what's coming in the future. We have an entire summit coming up about Jetpack Compose and Advanced Compose, including testability and accessibility in UI. So that's where some of this talk is coming from, and I'll let the video take it away from here. Hey there. So this is kind of a janky demo I have to do because this is a little bit difficult to record. But given that the shortcut has been turned on, I'm going to show you what it's actually like to use TalkBack and some of the little tips about how to use it. Because as people with, assuming that we are not somebody who needs this assistive tool, using our eyes to use TalkBack might be a little bit peculiar, considering that what we see on the screen is not actually the way that it's engaging with our interactions in touch. So first of all, let's just turn on the TalkBack shortcut.
TalkBack on. InRhythm 2023 Q3 Summit. Unlabeled button. Double tap to activate.
So this is a demo application for a summit that we'll be putting on in a couple weeks' time. But you'll see that, first of all, it said the name of the application and it highlighted this button up here, this little home. And it also was a button and not highlighted. Now, when we want to move through things in TalkBack, we don't actually tap and swipe like we do with where it is on the screen. We actually do forward and backward just across the screen, and it will jump between items. So just swiping this way anywhere on the screen.
Home. Home 0. Home 1. Home 2. Home 1. Home 0.
This is because people who are using accessibility functions like this might not actually have perfect vision. And so therefore they don't know where to tap on the screen. They don't know what is there. So they just keep going forward, 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 have things read out to them. Now, another interesting thing is that when you have elements that are tabbable, toggleable, selectable, or are elements within a set of elements like these tabs down here, you'll notice something very interesting.
Selected, home, tab, 3 of 5, in list, 5 items.
So you see how it told us that there were 3 items here. Home, it was selected, it was the 3rd item.
Tools, tab, 4 of 5. Double tap to activate.
Cool, huh?
Testing, tab, 5 of 5. Double tap to activate.
And like it said, double tap. Just like we swipe anywhere on the screen, we double tap anywhere to select things. Because remember, you should close your eyes when using accessibility. If you can use your app with your eyes closed, then you know you're accessible.
Selected. Tool. Home. Anims. Tab. 2 of 5. Anims. Selected. Tool. Testing.
Then let's kind of go up here.
Testing tab page. Semantics. What are semantics? Why do we testing tab? Unlabeled button out of list. Semantics. Merge descendants. Description in list. Double tap to activate.
So you see there, it's telling us this is an item in a list. So TalkBack can be quite useful for letting people know the context of what they're looking at and how to describe things. Now, this next page is a demo we're going to be doing in our summit actually in 2 weeks, but I wanted to show it to you guys now that when doing semantics as well, it's not just simply about making sure things read out, but making sure that they're contextually relevant to the people using the accessibility tools. So for example here,
unlabeled, merge, label.
So you see here, I have 2 different types of rows. They're basically the same. But in this first one, I do not have something called merge descendants turned on. And for a user, if you think about what a row is in a table, generally all the information in that row is considered one item, one element of useful information. But here, I have them all separated. So I have to go one by one.
Sub-label, sub-value.
And if this is a long list and I have to do 4 swipes per row, that's going to take me forever to get the information when really I care about all 4 of these elements are one row, one element of information. And so as a way to just think about accessibility for your users, something called merge descendants allows us to say all these things are connected. So watch what happens on the next row.
Labeled merged, sub-labeled merged, value merged, sub-value merged.
Now, I mean, the text actually being read isn't that important, but it did consider all elements in there, one item. Now, the important part about thinking with this type of approach is not how do I merge things, but for somebody who needs to use this, the breaking between the narration allows them to consider items as one piece of context, one element of information. So we should do our best to make sure that the information is presented in proper quantas, in a quantization, in a packet. And so therefore, using things like merge descendants is a good way to start thinking of it, accessibility. There are many other tools and tricks and tips. So this is just one of the interesting ones about showing you, first of all, how to use TalkBack, but also some of the things to consider about using it. I really recommend that should you ever need to begin using TalkBack, just close your eyes, like take the 5-minute course on it on Google, figure out how to use it a little bit, and then close your eyes and try using your phone or using your app. I think that'll really give you the opportunity to see how accessible you are. All right. Well, that's our introduction to accessibility, particularly on Android phones. I know that we spent a lot of time talking about the theory at a high level with things like how to write some UI that's flexible, color theory and contrast, and then also a little bit about the accessibility tools in Android. This is a topic that can go super deep. People can focus their entire careers just on this. But it is important for companies to be considering it. It's important for us as developers to be writing our UIs to allow these sorts of interactions. And I think it's important for us to consider it just from being a good guy, making sure that our work is not excluding anybody. We want everybody to be able to use our work, and this is one of those ways. So anyways, thank you for coming to the lightning talk today. I'll hand it back to the other presenters. But yeah, I hope you learned a little bit about accessibility today. Thank you.
Awesome. That was great, Greg. Thank you so much for that. And it definitely does make us realize that we really need to take into account every single aspect while developing an application. There's a lot of things, regarding, I remember one time I went to Apple in a workshop, and one of the things that Apple looked at was the contrast color, which Greg briefly mentioned. And they said, well, there's a lot of people with color blindness. So you can't take into account things that are just based on color and use that as a determining or a factor or as an action. It just really opened my eyes to accessibility and how important it is. And thank you all for joining us today. And Greg did mention this briefly, but we will be hosting our Propel summits. And this is going for iOS, Android, DevOps, SDETs, as well as backend systems. So make sure you follow us for more updates. And this is definitely something that you'll be interested in. It is a full workshop, or actually half-day workshop for each one of those platforms. And we'll be talking about different topics, which, like I said, we will be advertising soon. And each one is going to be doing a deep dive as well as demos. So, and we'll provide code samples as well, so you'll be able to tag along as well. And just a reminder, join us every Thursday at 5:15 Eastern Time, so that we can discuss the thought leadership across different platforms. And for next Thursday, we will be talking about Compose multi-platform with our Android engineer, Mike D. Phillips. Yeah, that said, hope you have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you next Thursday.